First National Bank of Blackwater. If you spend enough time wandering around Blackwater in Red Dead Redemption 2, you'll probably notice something odd. The town feels way more organized than the rest of the map. The streets are cleaner, the buildings look newer, and nobody seems to be throwing punches outside a saloon every 5 minutes like in Valentine. Blackwater is basically Rockstar showing us what happens when the Wild West starts putting on a suit and pretending to be civilized. And sitting in the northern part of town is the future home of one of the most important buildings in the game, the First National Bank of Blackwater. During the main story of RDR2 in 1899, the bank isn't even there yet. It's just an empty spot where the town clearly planned to put something big. And if you know the story, it's not hard to guess why construction probably got delayed. Earlier that same year, Dutch's gang pulled the infamous Blackwater job, which turned into what the game politely calls the Blackwater Massacre. A lot of money went missing, a lot of people got killed, and the entire town basically went, yeah, maybe we should pause major investments for a minute. Because nothing scares investors more than a group of outlaws treating your town like a financial pinata. Fast forward to the epilogue. In 1907, and the situation looks very different. By this point, Blackwater has started growing into a proper city, and the First National Bank is finally standing. It's a 2-story building with a small lobby, offices upstairs for employees and the manager, and a vault room in the back where all the important money sits waiting for someone with a terrible life plan to try stealing it. Unfortunately for players, the bank is still under construction during this time, so you can't rob it, and you can't even poke around inside. Rockstar basically leaves it there like a giant locked door saying, come back later. And if you've played Red Dead Redemption, you know exactly why. Because in 1911, that bank becomes the stage for one of the most chaotic moments in the series. During the mission, Great Men Are Not Always Wise, Dutch van der Linde decides that robbing a heavily guarded bank in a growing government-controlled town is a fantastic idea, which if you've followed Dutch's plans up to this point, should already sound like a disaster. The robbery quickly turns into a full-blown shootout between Dutch's gang and the Bureau of Investigation, with John Marston forced to fight his way through the bank. What makes the First National Bank of Blackwater interesting isn't just the shootout, though. It represents something bigger happening in the world of Red Dead. Banks like this were becoming symbols of the new America, structured, controlled, and protected by the government. The old frontier was disappearing, and the age of corporations and federal agencies was taking over. And right in the middle of that, shift. You've got Dutch van der Linde trying to rob a modern bank like it's still 1875, which honestly explains a lot about how the gang kept getting themselves into trouble. Moyne National Bank.
Bill, let's hitch up here.
Once you reach St. Denis in Red Dead Redemption 2, the game makes one thing very clear. This place is not the Wild West anymore. It's crowded, industrial, full of factories, police, trolley cars, and people who probably file taxes on time. Basically the exact opposite environment where a group of outlaws should be planning a robbery. And yet, naturally, that's exactly what Dutch's gang decides to do with the Moyne National Bank. This bank sits right in the middle of St. Denis between Frontier and Lamarck Street, and just a short distance from the St. Denis Police Department, which already sounds like a terrible place to commit a crime, but apparently the gang didn't open Google Maps before planning this job. The building itself is a big 2-story structure with a large decorated lobby, marble floors, tall ceilings, the kind of place designed to make customers feel like their money is safe. The vault sits deeper inside the building, though players can only actually access it during certain missions, or if you're the type of player who enjoys breaking the game with glitches. From a historical perspective, the Moyne National Bank fits perfectly into the era Rockstar is portraying. The bank is said to have been founded in 1848, which lines up with the period when southern states were expanding their banking systems to support growing trade, plantations, and urban centers. Cities like New Orleans, which St. Denis is clearly inspired by, became financial hubs, where banks handled massive amounts of regional wealth. In other words, this wasn't some small-town safe with a few gold bars. This was the kind of bank where robbing it meant you were officially declaring war on the entire system. And that's basically what happens. During the mission, Banking, the Old American Art, Dutch believes this robbery will finally give the gang enough money to escape the country and disappear somewhere tropical. Because if there's one thing Dutch always has, it's confidence in plans that immediately go wrong. The Moyne National Bank represents something important in the world of Red Dead, the rise of powerful financial institutions in major cities. These banks symbolized modern wealth, government oversight, and economic control. And unfortunately for Dutch's gang, those are exactly the kinds of places where outlaw plans tend to fall apart the fastest. Valentine Savings Bank. Bank in Valentine.
I'm not sure this is quite the place.
This next organization is also a bank, and it's in Valentine, a town where fistfights break out before breakfast, and half the population smells like whiskey and horse sweat. That brave little financial institution is the Valentine Savings Bank. You'll find it right in the center of town. Compared to the fancy banks in St. Denis, this place keeps things simple. One floor, a small lobby where the clerks sit behind their desks pretending everything is under control. And in the back sits the important part, the vault room and the office where the banker handles the town's money. According to the game's story, the bank started operating in 1861. That lines up nicely with real American history. Around that time, frontier towns started setting up local savings banks to support cattle markets, railroad expansion, and general trade. These weren't giant corporate institutions yet. Usually a handful of employees ran the whole place, and the vault mostly relied on thick steel and the hope that nobody with dynamite showed up, which unfortunately becomes a problem in Red Dead Redemption 2. During the mission, Sodom? Back to Gomorrah, the Vander Linde gang decides this quiet little bank needs an unexpected audit. Arthur Morgan rides into Valentine with Lenny Summers, Bill Williamson, and Karen Jones to pull off the robbery. The Valentine Savings Bank represents the classic frontier banking organization: small staff, simple security, and complete faith that the town around it won't cause trouble. Unfortunately for them, Valentine specializes in trouble. Boles Overland Stagecoach Company.
Not much.
Yeah, it ain't much, because it was a trap. Stage company.
Before trains started dominating the country, another organization basically ran long-distance travel across the American frontier: stagecoach companies. And in Red Dead Redemption 2, one of the biggest names doing that job is the Boles Overland Stagecoach Company. Think of them as the Wild West version of public transport, except the ride comes with dust, armed guards, and a very real chance someone might try to rob you halfway down the road. Boles Overland operates across the southern United States, but the company mainly runs its routes through Moyne, with major stops in Rhodes and St. Denis. If you've ever used the fast travel stagecoaches in the game, chances are you've interacted with their service without even thinking about it. Walk up to the driver, pay the fare, and they'll take you straight to another town. Simple business model, people pay money, the coach moves, everyone hopefully arrives alive. Historically, this kind of organization mirrors real companies like Wells Fargo and Butterfield Overland Mail, which transported passengers, mail, and sometimes large amounts of money across huge distances during the 1800s. Stagecoaches didn't just move people, they carried payroll, bank transfers, and valuable cargo between towns, which also made them one of the most popular robbery targets in the entire frontier. And that pattern shows up perfectly in the game. Several robberies in Red Dead Redemption. 2 specifically target Boles Overland banking coaches, including companion activities with gang members. These wagons often carry money shipments moving between towns, which obviously catches the attention of a group of professional outlaws. Most of the time, the robberies go exactly how you'd expect. Arthur and the gang stop the coach, deal with the guards, and take the cash. In real life, companies transporting money regularly worked with marshals and armed escorts to deal with bandits, which means Boles Overland wasn't just a travel company. It also sat right in the middle of the ongoing war between outlaws and the law. And in the world of Red Dead, running a business that transports money across outlaw territory is basically asking for trouble. Davis Overland Dispatch Company, Transportation Company.
Do you like an issue?
If you spend enough time using stagecoaches in Red Dead Redemption 2, you'll start noticing something interesting. Not every coach belongs to the same company. Different organizations run different routes across the map, and one of the bigger transportation networks in the game goes by the name Davis Overland Dispatch Company, usually shortened to DOD. This company handles stagecoach travel across large parts of the frontier, especially in New Austin and West Elizabeth. Their routes connect towns like Tumbleweed, Armadillo, Blackwater, Strawberry, and even McFarland's Ranch. So if someone in the desert needed to reach civilization, or just wanted to leave Armadillo as fast as possible, there's a good chance a Davis Overland coach handled that ride. As an organization, DOD represents the type of transportation companies that kept the American frontier connected before cars and widespread rail networks took over. In the 1800s, stagecoach companies worked like a mix between a bus service, a mail carrier, and sometimes even a moving bank vault. They transported passengers, letters, business packages, and occasionally large sums of money between settlements that sat hundreds of miles apart, which also explains why stagecoaches constantly attracted attention from outlaws. Inside the game, you can actually use the company's services the same way people would have in real life. Walk up to one of their stops, pay the fare, and the driver takes you across the region. Or if you meet a coach out on the road, you can simply ask the driver for a ride. It's basically the Wild West version of catching a bus. just with more horses and slightly worse suspension. What's interesting, though, is how the company's coaches appear all over the map, sometimes even in towns that technically belong to other stagecoach lines. You'll occasionally see Davis Overland coaches in places like Rhodes, Valentine, St. Denis, Ansburg, or Emerald Ranch, even though other companies supposedly run those routes. That little detail actually mirrors real transportation competition in the 1800s. Stagecoach companies constantly pushed into each other's territories, competing for passengers, contracts, and delivery routes. So while the gunslingers and outlaws grab most of the attention in Red Dead Redemption 2, organizations like the Davis Overland Dispatch Company quietly keep the frontier running in the background, because before trains and automobiles took over, the entire West moved at the speed of a stagecoach. S.M. Neely Ship, Chandler and Grocer. Now, most of you won't realize this while playing the game, but general stores were actually powerful little organizations on the frontier. Not corporations, not banks, but places that quietly kept entire towns running. And in Blackwater, one of those businesses goes by the long, slightly fancy name S.M. Neely, Ship Chandler and Grocer. Most of you would also know it as the Blackwater General Store. The shop stocks pretty much everything a growing town needs. Walk inside and you'll find food supplies, preserved goods, tobacco, liquor, grooming items, and all the everyday stuff people relied on in the late 1800s. If someone in Blackwater needed basic supplies, chances are they ended up here. But the name Ship Chandler actually hints at something interesting. Historically, ship chandlers were merchants who supplied ships with equipment, food, rope, and other necessities before long journeys. Cities connected to rivers or trade routes often had businesses like this to support shipping and transportation. And Blackwater fits that idea perfectly. The town sits along a major water route and acts as one of the most developed trade centers in the region. So, a store like S.M. Neely's would have played an important role in supplying travelers, merchants, and workers passing through the area. Inside the game, the store also doubles as something slightly unexpected, because Blackwater doesn't actually have a gunsmith. So, the general store ends up filling that role too. Alongside groceries and tobacco, the shop sells a small selection of firearms and ammunition, including the Schofield revolver, Litchfield repeater, and pump-action shotgun. It's basically the only place in town where someone can buy both canned peaches and a weapon capable of starting about small war, which feels very on-brand for the Wild West. Arthur Morgan also mentions in his journal that he bought a new notebook while staying in Blackwater, after losing his previous one in a fire months earlier. The game never states it directly, but this store strongly suggests where that purchase happened. So in a quiet way, this little business might be responsible for the journal that documents Arthur's entire story. St. Denis Times-Tribune.
43. Do you like an issue?
Now, most of you guys would have missed this, but even when you're robbing banks and causing chaos across the map, someone is writing about it the next morning. That job falls to the St. Denis Times-Tribune, usually called the St. Denis Times. It's one of the 3 newspaper organizations operating in Red Dead Redemption 2, alongside the new Hanover Gazette and the Blackwater Ledger. And unlike the gunslingers running around the frontier, this organization fights its battles with ink and headlines. The newspaper operates out of the St. Denis Times-Tribune building, one of the taller structures in the city. The company has been around since 1832, which makes sense considering St. Denis represents a large industrial city inspired by places like New Orleans. By the early 1800s, cities like that already had established newspaper publishers shaping public opinion, reporting crime, and keeping track of politics. And in the world of Red Dead, they also keep track of your mistakes. As the story progresses, new issues of the St. Denis Times appear after major missions. Vendors walk around St. Denis and even Rhodes selling copies, shouting headlines the way real newspaper boys did in the late 19th century. Pick one up and you'll often see articles about events Arthur and the gang were involved in. Bank robberies, train disasters, shootouts. The paper covers it all. Sometimes the reports exaggerate things, sometimes they get details wrong, but the point is clear. Word spreads fast, which is actually very historically accurate. Newspapers were the main source of information across American cities in the 1800s, shaping how people understood crime, politics, and famous outlaws. Many legendary criminals became well known, precisely because newspapers turned their crimes into dramatic stories. The St. Denis Times also has a bit of internal drama. The paper belongs to Hector Fellows, a wealthy newspaper tycoon who openly dislikes Mayor Henri Lemieux. That rivalry reflects another real-world detail from the era. Newspaper owners often used their publications to attack political opponents or influence local power struggles. So the St. Denis Times doesn't just report the news, it also shapes it. Over the course of the game, multiple issues appear. gradually moving from issue number 43 all the way to number 56, each unlocking after major story events. It's Rockstar's way of showing how the world reacts to everything happening around it, and honestly, it's kind of hilarious. Arthur and the gang spend months trying to stay hidden, while a newspaper company quietly prints their adventures for half the state to read over breakfast. The Blackwater Ledger. Last but not least, this is something the Vanderlinde gang probably never enjoyed reading over breakfast. The Blackwater Ledger. Because if anything big happens around the frontier, there's a good chance this newspaper organization will print it, usually with your name somewhere in the article. The Blackwater Ledger operates as one of the main newspaper publishers in the Red Dead universe. In Red Dead Redemption, it's the primary newspaper source, and in Red Dead Redemption 2, it stands alongside the St. Denis Times and the new Hanover Gazette as one of the three major papers, all reporting on events across the region. And just like real newspapers in the late 1800s, this one keeps a close eye on crime. Vendors regularly sell copies in towns like Blackwater and Strawberry, shouting headlines and trying to grab the attention of anyone walking by. Pick up an issue and you'll often find articles describing robberies, disasters, or violent incidents the player may have been involved in. The organization runs its operations out of the Blackwater Ledger local news printing and publishing building, right in the city of Blackwater. The company belongs to newspaper owner A. H. McKinley, another example of the wealthy publishing figures who controlled large newspapers during that era. Historically, newspapers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries played a huge role in shaping public opinion. Powerful publishers often decided which stories received attention, which criminals became famous, and which political ideas gained support. In many frontier towns, newspapers didn't just report the news, they helped define the reputation of entire regions. The Blackwater Ledger follows that same idea inside the game's world. Unlike the St. Denis Times, which focuses on the big, industrial city, the Ledger mainly covers the growing towns out west. It publishes on a regular schedule, typically Mondays and Fridays, and vendors distribute the paper across nearby settlements. So even if Arthur and the gang manage to ride away from a robbery unnoticed, the story might still show up in print a few days later. Because in the Red Dead world, you can outrun the law sometimes, but you can't outrun the newspaper guy yelling headlines on the street corner. Bank of Rhodes.
Judging from your outfit, I assume you're a musician of some sort, yes?
What's the worst place to build a bank? Probably a quiet town, sitting right in the middle of outlaw territory, where a gang like the Vanderlinde crew regularly rides through. And yet, that's exactly what someone did when they built the Bank of Rhodes. You'll find it sitting along the main road in Rhodes. The dusty southern town caught in the middle of the Gray and Braithwaite family feud. The building itself keeps things simple. One floor, a small lobby where the clerks handle business. And behind that sits the office and the vault room, where the real money stays locked up. According to the in-game background, the bank started operating in 1855, making it one of only 2 banks in the entire state of Moyne. That actually lines up with how frontier banking worked during the mid-1800s. Smaller southern towns usually had a single local bank that handled deposits, loans, and payments for farms, plantations, and nearby businesses. In other words, if money moved through Rhodes, it probably passed through this building, which obviously makes it very interesting to a group of professional outlaws. The Bank of Rhodes becomes the target of a robbery during a companion activity, where Arthur teams up with Uncle and Charles. And if you know Uncle Mao, you already know this plan probably started with him saying something like, "I got a real easy job for us." The trio waits until nightfall before making their move. Instead of walking through the front door like normal customers, they go for the outlaw solution. Dynamite. They blow a hole straight through the outside wall of the vault room, climb inside the bank, and find the vaults already damaged enough to open without much trouble. For once, the job actually goes pretty smoothly. No massive shootout, just a quick robbery and a fast ride out of town. The gang rides off with $762.50, which in 1899 was a pretty decent payday, though knowing Dutch, he probably still called it not enough money for the plan. The Bank of Rhodes represents another classic small-town financial institution of the frontier era. A local organization, handling the region's money, quietly supporting the town's economy. And unfortunately for them, they built their vault. In a world where Arthur Morgan travels with a lot of dynamite, Bank of Armadillo. The Bank of Armadillo had the worst possible timing in the entire Red Dead world. Because imagine opening the only bank in the entire state of New Austin, and then your whole town gets hit by a deadly cholera outbreak. Yeah. Business probably wasn't great that year. The Bank of Armadillo sits right on the main road of the town. And like most frontier banks, it keeps things simple. One floor, a small lobby where customers handle their deposits. And behind that sits the vault room, where the town's money stays. Locked away. Nothing fancy. Just a straightforward financial institution, trying to serve a desert town that spends most of its time dealing with outlaws and survival. The bank was founded sometime before 1898. That actually fits the historical pattern of frontier banking. Isolated regions usually depended on a single local bank to manage loans, ranch payments, cattle money, and trade between settlements. If someone in New Austin needed to deposit cash or move money around, this was basically the place. But when players visit Armadillo during Red Dead Redemption 2's epilogue in 1907, the town is dealing with something far worse than financial problems. A severe cholera outbreak spreads through the area, leaving buildings abandoned and businesses shut down, including the bank. So when you walk past it in RDR2, the doors stay closed, and the interior remains inaccessible. The place looks like a financial institution that's suddenly froze in time. Interestingly, the full interior actually exists in the game files. Some players have managed to explore it using mods or glitches. Rockstar built the inside. Yeah, they just never let players officially walk through the front door. Things work very differently years later, during the events of Red Dead Redemption. By then, the bank operates normally again. Players can enter the building, or rob it if they feel like causing problems. Inside, you'll find safes and chests containing respectable amounts of money, which, of course, immediately attracts the attention of anyone with a gun and a questionable moral compass. Because if there's one rule in the Red Dead universe, it's this: build a bank in the middle of outlaw country, and someone is definitely going to test your vault. West Elizabeth Cooperative Bank. This is the bank that helped John Marston go from outlaw to homeowner with a mortgage. That organization is the West Elizabeth Cooperative Bank, one of the earlier financial institutions operating in Blackwater. Founded in 1851, the bank existed to provide loans and financial help to the citizens of West Elizabeth. Think of it less like a massive corporate bank and more like a community financial institution. The kind that helped farmers, ranchers, and small businesses keep things running. Cooperative banks like this actually existed all over the 19th century United States. They focused on supporting local communities rather than giant corporations. Ranchers needed money for land. Merchants needed credit for supplies. Settlers needed help getting started. A bank like this would step in, give loans, and hope people paid them back. And surprisingly, sometimes they did. Of course, being a bank in the Wild West also meant occasionally dealing with the other side of frontier economics. Outlaws. At some point before the events of the game, the bank was robbed by the infamous Outlaw Brothers, Otis and Frank Miller, which probably made the staff rethink their security policies. The bank also shows up in Red Dead Online, where a criminal named Thomas Bradshaw attempts to rob it in 1898. His plan goes about as well as most outlaw plans in this universe. It fails. A bounty gets placed on his head, and players can track him down for the reward. But the bank's most important moment happens during Red Dead Redemption 2's epilogue. After leaving Pronghorn Ranch, John Marston rides into Blackwater, hoping to secure a loan so he can buy Beecher's Hope. The rundown ranch Abigail wants to turn into a real home. John isn't exactly the type of guy banks normally trust, but ranch owner David Geddes gives him a recommendation. That introduction leads John to Ansel Atherton, a banker at the Cooperative Bank and a distant relative of Geddes. And somehow, it works. Atherton approves a loan for John to purchase Beecher's Hope, and even gives him a line of credit to buy timber and equipment to rebuild the ranch. Which means, the quiet financial paperwork inside this bank eventually leads to the home where the entire Marston story continues. Unfortunately, the bank itself doesn't last forever. Sometime between 1907 and 1911, the newly built First National Bank of Blackwater replaces it, and the old cooperative bank building turns into a jewelry store. So, in true Wild West fashion, the institution that helped build John's ranch eventually gets replaced by a place selling fancy watches. Heartland Stage Line. There are different stage line companies, different organizations run different routes, and one of the busiest local transportation networks in Red Dead Redemption 2 is the Heartland Stage Line, usually shortened to HSL. This company has been around for a long time. It started operating in 1849, right around the period when stagecoach travel exploded across the American frontier. During that era, towns needed reliable ways to move people, mail, and supplies between settlements, especially before railroads reached every region, and that's exactly the job the Heartland Stage Line handles. The company mainly runs routes through New Hanover, connecting towns like Valentine, Annesburg, Van Horn Trading Post, and Emerald Ranch. If someone needed to travel across that region without riding a horse for half a day, the stagecoach became the practical option. Walk up to one of the stops, pay the driver, and they'll take you straight to another settlement. Basically, by the Wild West version of catching a bus. Except the bus has horses and occasionally gets robbed. In-game, you can use the Heartland Stage Line just like the other stagecoach services. You can buy a ticket at one of their stops, or sometimes, just ask a driver you meet on the road if they're heading somewhere useful. Interestingly, the Heartland Stage Line may draw inspiration from the California Stage Company, one of the largest stagecoach operations in the real American West. The connection shows up through an in-game folk song that resembles a real historical song sung by stagecoach drivers and workers during long journeys across California. So, while gunslingers and outlaws grab most of the attention in Red Dead Redemption 2, organizations like the Heartland Stage Line quietly keep the region connected, because without stagecoach companies, moving people and supplies across the frontier, half these towns wouldn't function at all. And Arthur Morgan would probably spend a lot more time riding very tired horses. Kuo Chow and Company. In the Chinatown district sits one of the more interesting organizations in the game. Kuo Chow and Company, better known to players as the Saint Denis Gunsmith. Now in a game full of gunsmiths, this shop stands out immediately. For one simple reason, the owner, Chu Ling. He's one of the few shopkeepers in the entire game who doesn't fit the typical Wild West stereotype. He's a Cantonese gunsmith, running a well-stocked weapon shop in the middle of St. Denis Chinatown. And honestly, if Arthur Morgan had to trust someone to keep his revolvers working properly, a professional gunsmith who deals with city customers all day probably isn't a bad choice. The store itself operates like a classic frontier weapons business. Walk in, and you can buy or sell firearms, stock up on ammunition, grab hunting gear, and generally prepare for whatever questionable life decisions Arthur plans to make next. Historically, gunsmith shops like this were extremely common in growing cities during the late 1800s. Urban centers needed weapon merchants to supply hunters, lawmen, private guards, and, let's be honest, the occasional outlaw pretending to be a hunter. But Kuo Chow and Company isn't just a normal weapons store, because behind all the legitimate business, there's a side operation happening in the back room. If Arthur pushes the situation a little, the gunsmith eventually reveals a hidden poker game running behind the shop. Walk through the back door, and suddenly, the place turns from a respectable weapons store into an illegal gambling den, where everyone definitely wishes you hadn't walked in. There's cash sitting on the table, more money locked in the safe, and of course, a guard who reacts exactly the way you'd expect. When a heavily armed outlaw interrupts poker night, and if Arthur takes too long to commit to the robbery, the guard skips the conversation and just starts shooting, which honestly feels like a very reasonable response. Another small detail adds even more personality to the place. Sometimes, you'll hear Chu-Ling complaining about having to pay protection, money, to Angelo Bronte's crime syndicate. That tells you something important about Saint Denis. Even legitimate businesses often answer to organized crime. So, Kuo Chow and Company works as both a legal gunsmith operation and a reminder that Saint Denis has its own criminal underworld, which means Arthur walks into the store to buy ammunition and accidentally discovers the Wild West version of a very shady casino night. Theodore Eckhart Stables. Now, most of you would agree with this. In Red Dead Redemption 2, your horse matters more than most people. It carries you across half the map, saves you during gunfights, and occasionally watches you crash into a tree at full speed. So someone has to run the businesses that keep those horses ready. Saint Denis, that job belongs to Theodore Eckhart, the owner of the Theodore Eckhart Stables. His operation sits in the southern part of the city, and it works as one of the main horse trading organizations in the region. Think of it as the Wild West version of a luxury car dealership. Except the engines eat hay. Eckhart runs a professional stable, where customers can buy horses, equipment, and supplies. Players can walk in and purchase several high-quality breeds, including the Arabian, the Turkoman, and the Nakota. And of course, the business doesn't stop at selling horses. Like most stable operators in the late 1800s, Eckhart also sells saddles, tack, and horse supplies. Historically, stables worked as full-service operations. Travelers needed places to buy horses, swap tired ones, repair equipment, and stock up before heading out across long distances. So businesses like this played an important role in keeping frontier travel moving. In the game, Eckhart himself usually hangs around the stable area or walks around nearby streets, checking on the animals and the property, which makes sense. When your entire business depends on expensive horses, you probably don't leave them unattended. The stable also pops up briefly during the mission, Fatherhood and Other Dreams Part 2. Though Eckhart himself doesn't appear during that moment, the location simply becomes part of the story unfolding in Saint Denis. Another small detail adds a bit of randomness to the character. Each time the stable owner appears in the game, his look can change between 3 different models, meaning players might see slightly different versions of Eckhart across playthroughs, which is kind of fitting for a stable owner in a busy city. Because if you're selling some of the fastest horses in Saint Denis, you're probably meeting a lot of customers who need to leave town. Very quickly, New Hanover Gazette. Now here's a funny thing. Arthur Morgan spends half the game trying not to get caught, while a newspaper keeps writing articles about everything he does. That newspaper is the New Hanover Gazette, one of the main news organizations operating across the frontier in Red Dead Redemption 2, along with the Blackwater Ledger and the St. Denis Times. This paper acts as one of the big information networks, spreading news across the region. And by news, we mostly mean all the chaos the player causes. The Gazette mainly circulates around New Hanover, especially in towns like Valentine and Antsburg. You'll often see paperboys standing on street corners, selling copies, yelling headlines, and trying to get people's attention. That detail actually mirrors real life. In the late 1800s, kids selling newspapers on busy streets was completely normal, and honestly, those kids probably had great material to work with in this world. Because the New Hanover Gazette constantly reports on major events happening throughout the story. After big missions or disasters, new issues become available. And if you pick one up, you'll often find articles describing robberies, train incidents, shootouts, or general mayhem explained to the entire state. The paper releases multiple issues as the story progresses, starting around issue number 27, and eventually reaching issue number 40 by the end of the narrative. Each new edition unlocks after major missions, which helps show how the world reacts to the gang's actions. Scarlet Horse Shop and B.R. Shelton. Livery and stable. Your horse carries you across the map, helps you escape trouble, and patiently waits while you spend 20 minutes looting a single cabin. So, naturally, the world of Red Dead has entire businesses built around horse trading and stabling. Two of those operations are the Scarlet Horse Shop and B.R. Shelton Livery and Stable. First up is the Scarlet Horse Shop, located northwest of Eris Field, right around the border between Scarlet Meadows and the Heartlands. This place serves as the main stable and livery operation for the Scarlet Meadows region. In simple terms, if someone around here needs a horse, this is where they go. Players can stable their horses, retrieve them, customize saddles and equipment, and of course, browse new horses for sale. And the selection is actually pretty solid. The shop sells breeds like the Ardennes, a heavy war horse built like a tank, the Dutch Warmblood, a reliable workhorse, and the much faster Missouri Foxtrotter, which is basically the sports car of the horse world. Although, the price difference between them is pretty funny. You can grab an Ardennes for about $140, but that Missouri Foxtrotter costs $950. So, congratulations. You just walked into a horse dealership where the upgrade costs more than a bank robbery payout. And if that still isn't fancy enough, there's another stable operation further west. In Blackwater, players can visit B.R. Shelton Livery and Stable, a long-established horse business operating in the older part of the city. This place deals in some of the best horses available in the game, including the Turcoman, the Missouri Foxtrotter, and the extremely expensive Arabian. The Arabian alone costs around $1,250, which means Arthur could probably buy a small house somewhere, or one very judgmental horse. Historically, businesses like these were extremely important in the 1800s. Livery stables served as transportation hubs, where travelers bought horses, rented them, boarded them overnight, or swapped out exhausted animals during long journeys. In other words, they were part stable, part dealership, and part roadside service station. And in Red Dead Redemption 2, they quietly power the entire world. Because without these horse businesses, Arthur Morgan would spend half the game walking, which, let's be honest, nobody has the patience for. Cornwall Kerosene and Tar. This is one of the biggest companies you will run into while wandering around in the Red Dead Redemption 2 game. And if the name Leviticus Cornwall sounds familiar, that is because this guy basically represents everything Dutch hates about the modern world. Big industry, big money, and even bigger influence. Cornwall Kerosene and Tar is essentially a massive oil refinery operation sitting right in the heartlands of New Hanover. If you have ever ridden through the plains and seen huge oil derricks, smokestacks, and trains hauling supplies around, that is Cornwall's business in action. The company's job is pretty simple. Extract oil, refine it into kerosene and other fuel products, and ship it across the country. Back in the late 1800s, kerosene was extremely valuable because it was used for lamps, heating, and early industrial machinery. So if you controlled oil back then, you were basically printing money. And Cornwall definitely controls a lot of it. Around the refinery, you will constantly see supply trains, wagons, workers, and armed guards moving in and out. It is less like a simple work site and more like a heavily protected industrial compound. In fact, if you hang around too long as Arthur, the guards start getting suspicious very quickly. Stick around even longer, and suddenly everyone there remembers they have rifles. So yeah, this is not the kind of place where you casually stroll in and say hello. Of course, being an outlaw means Arthur eventually ends up getting involved with the refinery anyway. At one point in the story, you actually sneak into the facility to steal an oil wagon for a train robbery. And if Arthur takes too long figuring things out, John Marston basically steps in like, "All right, I will do it myself," and grabs the wagon instead. Later on, the refinery becomes important again during Arthur's involvement with the Wapiti tribe. Arthur sneaks into the refinery to steal some important company documents, and things quickly go from quiet infiltration to a giant oil explosion. Because when you mix sabotage with barrels of fuel, subtlety usually stops being an option. Eventually, the conflict around Cornwall's operation turns into a full attack when Eagle Flies and his warriors assault the refinery, hoping to strike back against the forces taking their land. It ends up being one of the more tragic moments in the story, showing how industrial expansion and native resistance collide in the late frontier. By the time the story reaches 1907, the refinery looks completely different. The once busy operation is abandoned, falling apart, and slowly turning into another forgotten ruin in the landscape. Which is kind of fitting. The place that once symbolized Cornwall's power ends up sitting empty in the middle of the plains. So Cornwall Kerosene and Tar is basically the industrial giant of the game world. Oil production, fuel refining, massive supply, lines, and enough money behind it to hire guards, trains, and entire armies if necessary. And if you ever ride past the refinery and think, maybe I should explore that place for a minute, just remember, the guards there are very enthusiastic about not letting you explore it. Rawson and Company.
Leather accessories for carrying and wearing weapons are an integral need, and indeed,
This is the company that almost every player has used in Red Dead Redemption 2, even if you did not really notice it at first. Because if you have ever walked into a general store, opened that big catalog on the counter, and spent 10 minutes deciding whether you really need another revolver, congratulations. You have already done business with them. Rawson and Company is basically the mail-order shopping empire of the Wild West. Instead of every small town stocking hundreds of different products, stores rely on this company's catalog. Inside that book, you will find just about everything an outlaw or a normal citizen could want. Weapons, clothing, ammunition, fishing gear, camp supplies, tonics. If it can be sold, it is probably somewhere in that catalog. So when Arthur flips through those pages at a store, he is essentially ordering items from a huge distribution company that ships goods all across the frontier. Think of it like the 1899 version of online shopping. Except instead of clicking Add to Cart, you are standing at a wooden counter while the shopkeeper watches you debate between two different types of hats. The company's catalog appears in pretty much every general store in the game. It does not matter if you are in Valentine, Rhodes, Strawberry, or St. Denis. That same thick book is sitting right there on the counter, which tells you something important about Rawson and Company. They are everywhere. Small towns, big cities, frontier settlements. They supply products to stores across the entire region. If a shop sells guns, clothing, or equipment, chances are it came from them. And the idea actually comes straight from real history. The company is inspired by Sears, Roebuck and Company, a real American mail-order business that started in the 1890s. Back then, people living in remote towns could order almost anything through a catalog and have it delivered by train. So Rockstar basically recreated that system in the game world, which means every time Arthur casually orders a new coat, a revolver upgrade, or a fishing rod, he is participating in one of the frontier's biggest retail operations, the Appleseed Timber Company.
Started with them setting up their camp. They're building their main foreman's office, and I've only really...
If you are riding through Big Valley in West Elizabeth, you might suddenly hear the sound of axes hitting wood and trees crashing down. That is usually your sign that you have found their logging camp. And compared to something like Cornwall's refinery, this place feels much simpler. No big factories, no giant smokestacks, just a group of workers, some tents, piles of logs, and a foreman trying to keep everything running while the forest slowly disappears one tree at a time. The company's whole job is exactly what the name suggests: cut down trees and turn them into timber. Lumber was incredibly important during the frontier era because towns were expanding fast. Houses, railroads, fences, bridges, everything needed wood. So the Appleseed Timber Company is basically one of those operations supplying building materials for all the growing settlements around the region. When Arthur first rides into the camp, things are not exactly going smoothly. The foreman is already stressed out because the workers are running low on supplies. Naturally, when he sees a heavily armed stranger riding in, his first thought is basically, hey, you would not happen to have some extra supplies on you, would you? And if you do, he will happily buy them. Although when he says he will pay a premium, what he really means is slightly less than what a normal store would give you. Later. Onwash, if you come back to the camp, you might find things getting a bit more dramatic. At one point, a tree falls on a worker and traps him underneath. Suddenly, the whole crew is scrambling to lift the log and pull the guy out. Arthur can help save him, which earns some honor, although the foreman immediately follows that heroic moment by telling the injured worker he will not be getting paid anymore. So, not exactly the world's most generous workplace. Then there is another problem the camp runs into: wolves. Apparently, the local wildlife is not thrilled about the forest being turned into lumber, so the foreman eventually asks Arthur if he can help deal with the situation. After clearing out the wolves, the foreman rewards Arthur with a nice payment for the trouble. And if you keep visiting the area over time, you will notice something interesting. The forest slowly disappears. Eventually, the entire logging operation shuts down because, well, they have cut down every tree in the area. When you return later, the camp is abandoned. The workers are gone, and only a few empty structures remain. It is one of those little environmental stories the game tells without making a big deal about it. B.D. and Company.
What the hell you doing here?
I ain't looking for no trouble. Just need a...
This may be the only company that every outlaw in the Wild West quietly appreciates. Because while other organizations are selling oil, lumber, or fancy catalog items, these guys are busy making something a little more important to Arthur Morgan: guns. BD and Company is a firearm manufacturing company that has been around since at least the late 1800s. And by the time the events of Red Dead Redemption 2 roll around, their weapons are already spread all across the country. If you have ever visited a gunsmith in the game and bought something that looks a little too powerful for hunting rabbits, there is a good chance BD and Company had something to do with it. Their two most famous products are the bolt-action rifle and the Evans repeater. The bolt-action rifle is one of those weapons that immediately makes Arthur feel like he has upgraded from cowboy with a gun to very serious marksman. It is powerful, accurate, and great for hunting large animals, or dealing with enemies who thought standing far away would keep them safe. You actually received this rifle during the mission, preaching forgiveness as he went. After that point, it becomes one of the most reliable weapons you can carry. Then there is the Evans repeater, which is basically the opposite approach. Instead of focusing on long-distance precision, this thing is built for rapid fire and chaos. The Evans repeater holds a huge amount of ammunition compared to other repeaters, which means Arthur can keep shooting long after everyone else has already run out of bullets. And if you have ever been in a massive gunfight in the game, you know that having extra shots ready is never a bad thing. What makes BD and Company interesting is that, unlike some other organizations, you do not see their factories or headquarters in the game. Their presence is more subtle. You mostly encounter them through their products. Visit a gunsmith, open a crate of weapons, or browse through the catalog, and there is a good chance you are looking at equipment made by them. Their firearms show up across towns, stores, and supply shipments all over the map. Spicen Mining Company. This company is tied to one of the most famous ghost towns in the entire Red Dead world, Tumbleweed. And if you walk around Tumbleweed carefully, you can actually spot their name written on the old assay office building. That is basically the place where miners would bring rocks and ore to be tested to see if there was actually gold, silver, or other valuable minerals inside. So right away, that tells you something important. Tumbleweed was not always the dusty, half-abandoned town you see later in the game. At one point, it was actually a mining town, and companies like the Spicen Mining Company were running the local industry. The idea was simple. Miners would dig up ore from nearby places, likely areas like Gaptooth Breach, and then bring it into town to be tested and processed. If the ore was valuable enough, it could be sold or shipped out for refining. That kind of business was pretty common in the real Wild West. Towns would suddenly grow around mining operations, fill up with workers, saloons, and stores, and then disappear just as quickly once the industry collapsed. And that is pretty much what happened to Tumbleweed. At some point, the mining economy started falling apart, and things got even worse when the railroad line completely skipped the town. Instead of running through Tumbleweed, the railway went around it, which meant trade and supplies stopped coming through the area. And in the frontier economy, if the railroad avoids your town, you are basically finished. People started leaving, businesses closed, and the once busy mining settlement slowly turned into a ghost town. By the time the events of the later story roll around, only a few people are left trying to keep order while the rest of the place falls apart. Without strong businesses like the Spicen Mining Company running things anymore, bandits and criminals eventually began moving in, which definitely did not help the town's reputation. So while the company itself does not play a huge active role in the game's events, its presence tells an important piece of the world's history: the Jameson Mining and Coal Company.
Good morning, mister.
Now let's head to one of the darkest and smokiest towns in Red Dead Redemption 2, Annesburg. Because this place exists for one main reason: coal. And the company running that entire operation is the Jameson Mining and Coal Company. If you have ever ridden into Annesburg, you have probably noticed it does not exactly feel like a cheerful vacation spot. The air is thick with smoke, everything is covered in coal dust, and most of the people there look like they have been working underground for way too many hours. That is because the town basically revolves around one thing: the mines. The Jameson Mining and Coal Company was founded by Archibald Jameson, and by the time the events of the game take place, they are running the massive coal mining operation right beneath Annesburg. Workers spend their days digging deep underground, pulling out coal that fuels factories, trains, and industry across the growing American frontier. And the company runs the town pretty tightly. They even work closely with the local sheriff when dealing with crimes, which means if you cause too much trouble around the mines, the guards and the law will both be very interested in talking to you. Now things get even more interesting when you realize Leviticus Cornwall is involved. Yes, the same Cornwall who owns the giant oil refinery. At one point, he starts looking into the Jameson Mining and Coal Company, possibly thinking about buying it or investing in it. That alone tells you how valuable the coal operation must be. If Cornwall is interested in your business, It means there is serious money involved. And of course, because this is Red Dead Redemption 2, the mine eventually becomes part of Arthur's story as well. Arthur visits the mines while collecting debts during Strauss's missions. That is where he learns that one of the workers he was looking for has already died. Not exactly surprising when you see the kind of dangerous conditions those miners are working in. Later on, the mines become even more chaotic during the later chapters. There are strikes, arguments with company officials, stolen shipments of dynamite, and eventually a full shootout as Dutch and the gang try to escape after one of their biggest confrontations. The Central Union Railroad Company. Now let's talk about something that quietly changes the entire world of Red Dead Redemption 2, the Central Union Railroad Company. Because while outlaws are busy robbing trains, someone actually has to build the railroads in the first place. And that is exactly what this company is doing out in Roanoke Ridge, where you can find one of their construction camps slowly pushing a railway through the wilderness. When you first ride past the site, it looks like a typical frontier work camp. Tents everywhere, piles of tools, workers hammering away at steel rails, and unfinished track stretching into the distance. It is basically a moving construction project. As the workers finish one section of track, they pack everything up and move the camp forward, slowly building the railway piece by piece. So every time Arthur returns to the area later in the game, the camp has actually shifted farther along the route. And the man trying to keep all of this organized is the foreman, Percy Whitsicle. Unfortunately for him, running a railroad construction crew comes with a lot of problems. The first issue Arthur runs into is someone stealing the workers' wages. Naturally, nobody is happy about that. Whitsicle asks Arthur to look into it. After some investigating, Arthur discovers the culprit is actually the junior foreman, who thought hiding the stolen money inside a tree was a brilliant criminal plan. At that point, Arthur gets a choice: bring him back, let him go, or solve the problem the old-fashioned outlaw way. Later on, when Arthur visits again, the construction has stopped completely because a group of hired thugs is causing trouble for the workers. And surprise, those thugs are working for Leviticus Cornwall. Apparently, Cornwall is not thrilled about a railroad expanding through the region without his involvement. So Arthur helps clear them out, which allows construction to continue and earns him a nice reward. By the time Arthur checks in for the final time, the project is nearly finished. The rails are almost connected, the workers are wrapping things up, and Whitsicle is finally starting to relax for once. And after the last stage is complete, something interesting happens. The entire camp disappears. All the tents, supplies, and workers pack up and leave because the job is finished. The railroad line is now complete, and the construction crew moves on to wherever the next project might be. One cool detail Rockstar added is that the workers at this camp are Cantonese immigrants. This is likely a nod to the real Chinese laborers who helped build large parts of the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1800s. The Pacific Union Railroad Company. The Pacific Union Railroad Company is literally one of the most powerful companies quietly operating across the entire map of Red Dead Redemption 2. And if you have spent any time near train tracks in the game, you have definitely already seen their work, because this company basically controls most of the trains traveling across the frontier. The Pacific Union Railroad operates rail lines through almost every territory in the game: New Austin, West Elizabeth, Barino, New Hanover, and Moyne. Their trains constantly move across the map carrying passengers, cargo, supplies, and sometimes things that outlaws like Arthur Morgan find very interesting. So whenever you see those long blue trains pulling into stations like Valentine, Rhodes, or St. Denis, chances are they belong to Pacific Union. And trains in the Wild West were a huge deal. They connected towns, transported goods, moved people across massive distances, and basically helped turn the frontier into a more modern and industrial world. If you controlled the railroads, you controlled trade, and that meant serious power, which is exactly why trains are such a common target for robberies in the game. Sometimes Arthur and the gang are the ones robbing them, and sometimes you will randomly come across other criminals trying their luck. For example, there is even a moment where the Del Lobo gang can be seen attacking one of the company's trains. The company also grows even bigger over time. After Leviticus Cornwall dies, Pacific Union actually buys another railway company called the Southern and Eastern Railway, expanding their control even further. They even take over the St. Denis trolley system, which Cornwall previously operated. So by the early 1900s, Pacific Union has basically become one of the largest transportation companies in the region. And the inspiration behind the company is very likely based on the real-world Union Pacific Railroad, one of the biggest rail companies responsible for building the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. So, in the world of Red Dead Redemption, Pacific Union represents the unstoppable spread of railroads across the frontier. Steel tracks cutting through forests, mountains, deserts, and plains, connecting places that used to be days apart by horseback, which is great for civilization. But if you are an outlaw trying to live outside the system, it also means there are suddenly a lot more trains to rob. The Southern and Eastern Railway. This is another railroad company you will see moving across the map. Or, if you want the full title, Cornwall Southern and Eastern Railways. And that second name should immediately give you a clue about who is behind the whole operation. Leviticus Cornwall again. Apparently owning oil refineries, factories, and half the industrial economy was not enough for him. Cornwall also decided it would be a good idea to control railroads. Because if you own the trains, you basically control how goods move across the frontier. So the Southern and Eastern Railway became one of Cornwall's transportation companies, running trains across different parts of the region long before the events of the game begin. And if you remember the very first big train robbery mission in Red Dead Redemption 2, that is actually one of Cornwall's trains. The gang's original plan was stolen from the O'Driscoll boys. Blow up the tracks in a tunnel near Cattail Pond and stop the train that way. Sounds simple enough. Except Bill's attempt at using dynamite goes completely wrong, which means the gang has to improvise. Instead of stopping the train first, Arthur, Lenny, and Javier end up jumping directly onto a moving Cornwall train from above the tunnel. And of course, things go about as smoothly as you would expect. Javier misses his landing completely, leaving Arthur and Lenny to deal with a whole train full of armed guards. Eventually, the gang fights their way through the cars, blows open Cornwall's private wagon with more dynamite, and discovers a stash of bonds that ends up becoming important later in the story. You will also see Southern and Eastern trains appear during several other missions throughout the game. They are constantly moving across the rail network, carrying passengers, cargo, and sometimes very important people. And because this is the Wild West, those trains occasionally attract the wrong kind of attention. For example, there is even a random encounter where the Moyne Raiders attack one of Cornwall's trains near Rhodes. Apparently, nobody told them robbing Cornwall's property is usually a very dangerous career choice. Eventually, though, after Cornwall's death in 1899, the company does not stay independent for long. The Pacific Union Railroad Company ends up buying the Southern and Eastern Railway, absorbing it into their much larger railroad empire. So in the end, Cornwall's railway becomes just another piece of a bigger corporate network spreading across the frontier. Which is kind of fitting, because in the world of Red Dead Redemption, the railroads keep expanding, the companies keep merging, and the wild frontier keeps getting a little less wild every year. The Cornwall City Railway. This one also belongs to Leviticus, Cornwall. At this point, it almost feels like if something in the game is large, expensive, and industrial, Cornwall probably owns it. The Cornwall City Railway was established in 1893. Its main job is running the trolley system in Saint Denis. If you have ever walked around Saint Denis, you have probably seen those electric streetcars rolling along the tracks through the city. They are basically the Wild West version of public transportation, moving people across the busy streets while everyone else is dodging horses and wagons. And for the time period, that is a pretty big deal. Saint Denis is supposed to represent a modernizing American city, and systems like the trolley service show how much things are changing compared to the old frontier towns. Instead of dusty roads and horseback travel, you have electric trolleys moving through crowded city streets. Of course, because this is Red Dead Redemption 2, the trolley eventually becomes part of a very chaotic situation. During the mission Urban Pleasures, Arthur, Dutch, and Lenny attempt to escape the police by hijacking one of the Cornwall trolleys, which sounds like a clever getaway plan, until Arthur ends up driving it. Let's just say Arthur Morgan is a fantastic outlaw, a great gunslinger, and a very capable cowboy. But trolley operator is not exactly on his resume. Within moments, the whole escape turns into a disaster. The trolley goes completely out of control, and the ride ends with a spectacular crash in the middle of Saint Denis. After Cornwall dies later in the story, the Cornwall City Railway also does not stay independent for long. The larger Pacific Union Railroad Company eventually takes over the operation and continues running the trolley system. So while Cornwall built the network, it ultimately becomes just another part of the expanding railroad empire spreading across the region. And even outside of missions, players can still hop onto these trolleys and ride it around the city, which is actually a pretty relaxing way to travel through Saint Denis, as long as Arthur is not the one driving it. Lannahechee and Midland Rail Company. This is another railroad company you will occasionally see moving across the tracks, usually shortened to L&M. And unlike some of the other rail companies we talked about, these guys are not really focused on passengers or fancy city transport. Their specialty is cargo, so instead of trains full of travelers heading to Saint Denis, Most L&M trains are hauling things like coal, industrial supplies, and heavy freight across the frontier, which makes sense, because a lot of their rail activity connects directly to mining areas, especially around Ansburg, where the Jameson Mining and Coal Company operates. In other words, if a mine digs something out of the ground, there is a good chance an L&M train eventually shows up to haul it away. Their rail lines stretch across several regions: Amberino, New Hanover, West Elizabeth, and Lemoyne, quietly moving cargo through the industrial side of the Red Dead world. And while they might not be the biggest railroad company around, they still manage to show up during some pretty memorable moments. For example, during the mission The New South, Arthur teams up with Sheriff Archibald McGregor to chase down the Anderson boys. They escape from a prison wagon and decide that jumping onto a moving L&M train is a brilliant getaway strategy. Unfortunately for them, Arthur Morgan is very good at ruining getaway plans. Later in the story, the company's trains show up again when Arthur has to outrun the law by racing a train during the mission Sodom back to Gomorrah, which is one of those moments where the game reminds you that horses are fast, but trains are still faster. Outside of missions, you can also encounter L&M cargo trains at freight stations across the map. And since they are mostly transporting goods instead of passengers, they tend to feel more like working industrial trains than the larger passenger lines operated by other companies. The railroad itself seems to be loosely inspired by the real-world Lehigh Valley Railroad, a company known for transporting coal and supporting mining industries in the United States.